All right, folks, this is Jeff Brown here, Merchandising Director, Best Cigar Prices, and we're here today. We're talking smack with the Toranos. We have Charlie and Jack Torano both here with us today. This is our fourth podcast that we have going on, and honestly, a long time we've been out because we haven't really had a lot to say. But heck, when you got Jack and Charlie Torano both in the same room with you, you know, this warrants, you know, putting on video. We've got, 5-6 cameras around here. We got microphones for days. So, we're going to go ahead and do this thing. But I think before we get started, guys, interesting little fact, I guess. Everybody thinks that you guys are brothers, cousins, whatever, or your uncle Jack to Charlie. Guys, what's your relationship with one another?
Jack's my great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather Jack. You heard it here first. It's old Jack.
All joking aside, Charlie's my second cousin. Charlie's dad and I are first cousins.
So we're talking, but this is what, fourth generation from
third
Cuba?
Generation. Charlie's fourth generation. We actually had a nice round of golf with Charlie's son, so we had third, fourth, and fifth generations represented.
Wow. And what were the scores?
It was a scramble. We did very well.
Oh, okay.
Thanks to the fifth generation.
Thanks to the fifth generation.
If you're not cheating, you're not trying. That's what my motto is in a scramble.
Yeah, we did not set the cart on fire.
Well, that's for a story for another day.
Yes.
Great story. I did hear that, by the way.
That was the new lighter. I cannot be responsible for that said golf cart. But so today we're going to talk a little bit about Cuba. I mean, we talked earlier, and if you guys are interested in Torano cigars, you can look on our website or any other website for that matter and get any description you want to with any Torano cigar that's out there. But today we're going to go down a different path. We're going to be talking about, since we've got third and fourth generation Cuba here, we're going to talk a little bit about the Torano heritage, what happened to the Toranos, good and bad in Cuba. And we'll get into today's thoughts a little bit. And we're going to talk a little bit, maybe even about the future, time permitting. So, somebody who wants to step up and start talking a little bit about
my older cousin Charlie start this.
All right, talking a little bit about the heritage of the Torano brands and the Torano name in Cuba.
Well, the Torano started in Cuba in 1916. Our great-grandfather, a gentleman by the name of Santiago Torano, started growing. Well, first he actually immigrated from Spain to Cuba. So he wasn't born in Cuba, but he's the first generation that began working in Cuba. And when he got to Cuba, the story is that he immediately fell in love, with the tobacco leaf, the leaf that we all love. And at first he started brokering tobacco leaves, right? He would go to the tobacco growers, he would get a lot of great tobacco, and then he'd go to the tobacco factories and sell them the leaf. So he was really a broker middleman. But soon after, he started to own some of his own tobacco farms and began tobacco growing in Cuba. And I always use the term he was blessed because in the end, he was blessed with 3 sons. He was blessed with my grandfather, Carlos Torano. He was blessed with Jack's father, Pepe Torano.
Jaime
Torano. And also there was Jose Torano, known as Pepe Torano. And so he had 3 sons, all 3 which were very involved in the tobacco business. And really the Torano family became one of the premier tobacco growers of Cuba, growing tobacco and selling tobacco to all the great Cuban cigar factories in Cuba, but also selling the Cuban leaf all around the world, selling it to the United States and to other parts of the world. Because back then the Cuban tobacco leaf was really sought after. Today we think of Cuban cigars and all the tobacco leaf pretty much stays in Cuba and is used for premium cigars. But back then, Cuban tobacco leaf was exported around the world. And so my grandfather, including the U.S., my grandfather did a lot of business with U.S. factories like the Newman family in Tampa. Stanford Newman was a good friend of my grandfather, Carlos Torano. And also the Colemans, for example, from General Cigar, bought a lot of tobacco, et cetera. So the Torano families were Cuban tobacco growers. And so to fast kind of forward to where your question started, so what happens to the family? And the story of the Torano family is not unique in the history of what happened to Cuba. In the end, all those farms were nationalized, all the cigar factories were nationalized by the government. And when that revolution came, it effectively wiped out all the families that had spent decades. Think about it. The Toranos alone from 1916 up to 1959 put all their heart and soul and all that work into tobacco growing. It was a leaf, and their product was appreciated around the world. And then really pretty much overnight, one can say, with the government changed.
It's no longer yours.
Yeah, they lost it all. And I will tell you one thing about my grandfather, which I didn't know until I got into this industry, was in the beginning years, we've all heard about the politics of Cuba, where you had Batista, who was in power, and Batista was a corrupt dictator, right? He was not elected. He had been elected before, lost an election, and then through a coup, Batista took over Cuba. And so a lot of people wanted change, right? Change is something that we hear about in all kinds of countries and in politics everywhere. But the truth is, sometimes things can get worse. And it did for Cuba. And my own grandfather was advocating at the time for that change. Yeah. And he was actually in favor of what the idea was, that the revolution was going to get rid of that dictator who was basically allowing the country to operate. There were newspapers. There was some freedom of the press. There were a lot of human rights violations. There were a lot of problems in Cuba, but business was flowing, right? But it needed a change. So what they proposed was, or what they thought that they were advocating for, those who supported the, quote, revolution, was to get rid of the dictator, go back to the Constitution, I think of the 1930s, and restore kind of Cuban democracy and bring it back. So there were people like Carlos Torano, like my grandfather, who when suddenly realized that what this revolution was anything but positive change, said, oh my God, now that we're in this mess. He actually stayed for a couple of years into the early 1960s, trying to figure out a way out of the mess that I think a lot of the Cubans at first thought would be positive and then turned out to be horrific, not only for the business, but for the island and for the freedoms and of the people. Mm-hmm. And the first thing that the Cuban government did is what a lot of those dictators do, is they got rid of the free press. They started attacking the so-called intellectuals. And the next thing you know, business is gone. The students and a lot of the intellectuals of the country had to flee. So obviously there's a lot to talk about there, but the initial is that, yes, the Torano family was very involved in the tobacco growing, and it was just tragic. One of their farms was such a premier farm called La Esperanza, that same farm today, and I can tell you this, I'm born and raised in Miami, right? I'm 50 years old. The Cuban issue, both of my parents, were Cuban. So the Cuba issue is very personal to Jack and I. It's very personal to our families. Our lives were completely affected by it. But all I can tell you is that in the end, everything that's happened in Cuba, to think that today, basically that same government is still in power, that Cuba has outlived the Soviet Union, that Cuba has outlived, so many horrific things that have happened. It's really amazing. But in the end, it was consequential. Since we're talking about cigars, it was extremely consequential in the world of cigars, and we can get more into that.
Sure. I mean, because as I understand it, when most of the Toranos fled the island of Cuba, they spread out throughout the world. And it's interesting, from wherever they went to, whether it was Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, Brazil, Ecuador, or the DR, that it seemed that tobacco started to flourish in those particular areas.
Well, look, my dad would always say that, as you said, that there in every tobacco growing region outside of Cuba, there was some Torano member who was there. And we certainly don't want to take credit as a family for, I appreciate the compliment of tobacco flourishing, but certainly were influential and instrumental in helping grow tobacco now. Imagine, the Cuban tobacco was the tobacco of the world, right? Premium handmade cigars were known as Cuban tobacco and Cuban cigars, right? So what ends up happening is when they lose the industry, I've always given a tremendous amount of credit that these men who'd built this industry over so many years, after they fled with little or no money and having lost everything that they had worked for, instead of giving up, the truth is they said, we're going to start this industry again, and we're going to start it in different countries. We're going to start using the seeds from Cuba, start testing it out in new geographic locations, see how it goes. And so I give tremendous credit to those early families, and the Toranos were just one of them. So again, I don't want anyone out there to think that we're not in any way taking credit. We're simply saying we were one of many Cuban cigar families who sacrificed and lost a lot, but then invested a lot of time and energy in, as you said, the Dominican Republic. That's where my grandfather went. Jack's dad went to Nicaragua. And we had, Arturo Torano went to Brazil. And there were many others that that had a tremendous influence in growing tobacco now in these other countries.
Sure. I mean, and there's, there are a ton of families, like you mentioned, a lot of father, son, and just, a lot of heritage that had left Cuba, kind of a brain drain on the tobacco. I mean, you got, there's so many of them. You got Plasencia, you got Padron, you got Fuente, just to name, a couple. And, those are some pretty powerful names that are still out there today, still involved in tobacco, but obviously in other countries. So what can we talk about next, Jack?
Anything you want, man.
Wow, you are the best. Let's talk a little bit about the mystique of Cuban cigars, just a little bit. How many times, and Jack, you're in a lot of retail stores out there, so I'm sure you have more stories to talk about than me. But I hear it from some of our customers that the famous one is, I was at the Dominican Republic. I was on vacation down there. And, I was drinking fruity drinks with a nice little umbrella in it on the beach. It was beautiful. And a guy came by and offered me
a glass top
with a nice glass top Cohiba from Cuba. And let me tell you what, it was the best $20 and the best cigar I ever spent. What is it about that? And what's the mystique and what's going on with Cuban cigars?
I mean, it truly is the forbidden fruit. I mean, a lot of people swear by Cuban cigars. I've smoked a lot of real Cuban cigars that, yeah, they do have a unique flavor when you get the right one. But unfortunately, in Miami, probably 99% of the cigars you're getting are fake Cuban cigars. I don't know what will ever change, even if the embargo were to end. I think counterfeiting will still thrive.
They're counterfeiting Nicaraguan cigars, for God's sake.
Yeah, they're counterfeiting Opus X's.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I even though that you come across these Cuban fanboys, for lack of a better word, and they will swear by these cigars and tell you that there's nothing in the world like it. But listen, I'm in cigar shops all around the United States, and I tell people that you're on the hunt for the greatest cigar. You want the best cigar in the world. Well, you're in luck, because the humidor in this store is carrying the best cigars in the world. The best growers, the best rollers, the best manufacturers, they've all fled Cuba long ago. And they're in Nicaragua, they're in the DR, they're in Honduras, and they're creating things that are just spectacular right now. And for anybody to think that a country that's been mired in communism for over 55 years is still making the greatest cigars in the world, it's just not happening.
It's a reach.
I think sometimes too, in addition to the forbidden fruit, is because going back in history, because Cuba was the original, and sometimes cigars in some parts of the world still get to refer to as an Habanos, right? Habanos are known as it's another word for cigars. It was the original. But I think what people have to understand is that really is the past tense. Those families, those great families that helped build that same mystique, those are the families that fled and started to create a tremendous industry in all these countries that we just mentioned. So it's been now 50 years. One can argue maybe in the early 60s, early 70s, when you're starting to grow this new tobacco in these different countries, maybe you could go back then and say, well, I wonder which one's better, and maybe Cuba was better then. But I believe hands down that the best tobacco that's being grown today, I do believe, is outside of Cuba. Does Cuba have the great soil and geography to grow great tobacco? Undoubtedly. Do they produce great tobacco because of that soil? Undoubtedly. But again, how many countries that have the level of dictatorship and just economic dysfunction that Cuba has? One of the big things that Cuba exports still today, they export people. In Venezuela, for example, I mean, the deal was, I'll send people over there to become doctors and lawyers and nurses and teachers. In return, I'll get oil. In other words, these countries are operating in ways that are still, in my opinion, it's barbaric how they've treated their people, the lack of freedoms, and to somehow then say that's the country that is producing the best product, when clearly you have these other great countries that are producing. And I think the proof is you can do it on the blind test. If I blind test those same people that want to tell me it's for sure the number one and the best tobacco, it's just simply objectively not true. But I will say to you, in some respects, those of us in the non-Cuban cigar industry, by the way, the biggest market for premium cigars in the world is the United States.
By far.
By far, that world is dominated by non-Cuban tobacco. So clearly, we're doing something right. It's not just population. It's that we're doing good things. We, meaning the non-Cuban cigar industry, is doing tremendous things. And I'm just still fascinated. But what I was going to say is some of us, or a lot of us in the industry, I think, have also been guilty in creating still that mystique about Cuba, because we will emphasize rightly so, we emphasize our Cuban roots, right? We emphasize the fact that sometimes we're using Cuban seeds grown in Ecuador. For example, I'll say to you, well, this particular, it's an Habano wrapper, right? It's a Cuban seed grown in Ecuador. Well, but every time I throw in Cuban seed and emphasize the Cuban aspect, even those of us in the non-Cuban cigar business, we're actually building the mystique. We're emphasizing it, and we don't realize it. So I think we all kind of fall guilty to it. I think the fairest thing to say is yes, because of the politics of Cuba, because Cuba was the original, Cuba has its rightful place in the cigar market of the world, and it should and will always be a topic of discussion. But beyond that, I really just believe that we have more than we in the non-Cuban cigar industry have more than exceeded in quality and presentation, complexity of blends, and certainly brands in the world today. It's amazing.
I always tell people the forbidden fruit aspect of it. Everybody wants it. It's a forbidden fruit. Growing up in Miami, we couldn't get Coors beer in the 70s. Coors beer was something you couldn't take east of the Mississippi. And anybody that went to any of our friends that would go to Colorado, you got to bring back this Coors beer. You got to bring back this Coors beer. And we'd get it, we'd chill it, we'd drink it, and we'd go, oh my God, this is the best beer on earth. Because it was a forbidden fruit at the time. Then they opened it up nationwide.
And then not so much.
How often have you had a Coors beer?
It's been a long time since I tasted the Rockies.
Yeah, it tasted like the Rockies.
So there's also been for years talk of Cuba opening, and from a retailer's perspective, what we would see or what we think is, at least at Best Cigar prices, is if Cuba were to open, we would notice obviously a spike in sales, almost like a mini boom from back in the day. And the reason for that would be if somebody were fortunate enough to get their hands on Cuban cigars and be able to feature them in their retail store, that, they would go for a hefty price. You're looking $20, $30, $40 per cigar. And with that being said, that other manufacturers out there would see these things being sold at $20, $30, $40 a cigar, and that, $5, $6, $7, $8 cigar would now become a $7, $8, $9, $10 cigar, thereby, increasing the prices and therefore
across the board.
Yeah, increasing sales across the board.
Yeah.
What are your guys' thought on Cuba? If it were to open, and being able to maybe blend with some Cuban tobacco along with Honduran and Nicaraguan and stuff like that. What do you guys think?
I think it'd be pretty cool. I mean, I think if the Cuban cigar, if the embargo were to end tomorrow, I think it'd be great. It would be a mini boom. Absolutely. It'd be they'd create a lot of new excitement, and I do believe that after it'll become, in the U.S., it'll become that special occasion cigar.
Sure.
But the guy that's going to spend $30-$40 on a cigar.
Here's my question, though. So with the way that question is phrased, which is the typical way it's phrased, what happens if the embargo is eliminated, let's say, from the U.S. side? What's the impact? It's a fair question. But my question is always, how does Cuba really open up? So let's say tomorrow we do wake up and for whatever reason, this administration, which I think are showing no indications of doing that, but let's say it did. My question is, that now means, in my opinion, that it's a one-way street in this sense. So I'm going to have Cuban cigars that are going to go, that are still monopolized and controlled effectively by the government, and whoever the government decides to be in partnership with from a distribution standpoint, so the cigars can come to Cuba. But here's my question. Am I going to be able to go to Cuba? Can I go and open a cigar factory like I can open up in the Dominican Republic, Honduras, or Nicaragua today? My answer is no. I'm not going to be able to go to Cuba and open up a cigar factory and hire 10 rollers and buy Cuban tobacco if all that happens is the embargo goes away. What's going to happen is that those who own brands that, for example, let's say, General owns Cohiba. Well, they're going to have to make an agreement with Cuba Tobacco and the country, and the businesses will get together and figure it out. So I'm going to have Cohiba cigars coming here. But if I, Charlie Torano, or anybody else, if John Smith wants to go to Cuba and either grow tobacco or start a cigar factory, right now the answer is going to be no, Charlie, you can't do that. No, John Smith, you can't do that, because the laws in Cuba wouldn't have changed. The only thing that's opening up is we're going to open up our market to the Cubans to come and export cigars here. And I still say to you, so if you're my grandfather, which again, my grandfather passed away in 1970, passed away a long time ago. But if you're a member of the Torano family and you had your farms,
17 of them taken by the government, and then you have those who own, like the Benji Menendezes of the world, who had their cigar factories nationalized by the government, can his family go back and start a cigar factory, the same one that was taken away? And my problem with that is the answer is no. Two things have to change. Fine, we'll let go of the embargo, but I need Cuba to open up to allow us then to compete so that, yes, we can blend and maybe make cigars in Cuba. The only thing that one could argue could happen is, well, Cuba maybe will allow the export of Cuba tobacco. I find that maybe to some degree they're going to be doing that. But what I think is going to happen is Cuba's going to hoard more of their own tobacco because now they have a new market, a bigger market to be able to sell cigars to. So I always think that the question in the end, street.
What's that?
It's a one-way street.
Oh, yeah.
It's a one-way street. So I always think it's a little bit more complex. So for 50 years, these families and all their related businesses that have been growing the non-Cuban cigar industry are now going to have to compete with what was formerly theirs, but they're not going to be able to compete with them fairly because they're not going to be able to go over there and start growing again. Forget about taking back the farms for a second. Mm-hmm. Forget about, getting compensated for what was stolen from them. I'm just talking about competition.
Sure.
So I tell my, some of those who say, oh, how unfair this embargo is, and let's just let the Cuban cigars be brought in here. I'm like, well, listen, I get it. If you're a cigar smoker, I understand you want that opportunity. I respect it and I get it. But you have to understand that from a personal standpoint, if you lost that business, if that money was stolen from you, and by the way, it wasn't just the businesses, the bank accounts, the cash, everything was taken. My grandfather on the other side, who was a lawyer in Cuba who had to flee, when he came here and he went to get a job as a janitor at the University of Miami, and he was wearing his three-piece suit in 1959, you know what they said to him? Sir, you're overqualified for this job. And he said, what do you mean I'm overqualified? I need a job. So a lot of these Cubans, and even though Miami today is flourishing and the Cubans have done very well, thank God for the United States, right? And the freedoms that we have here. But a lot of people suffered a lot. So I just don't think it's as simple as, let's let all those cigars come over here. Because you said it right, Jeff. All of a sudden, maybe a third of retail stores, assuming they can get the quantities, are going to be filled with those Cuban cigars. Well, I'm sorry, guys, but some cigars are going to be washed out of those humidors to make room for those Cuban cigars. So you're going to get slapped again. So I'm all for the competition. The non-Cuban cigars can compete with Cuban cigars. I've always just advocated, make it fair, make it two ways. And if you don't make it two ways, in my opinion, you're hurting those people again.
Yeah, no, that's an awesome point. Great point.
And that's what it is. A lot of these people that talk to me about Cuban cigars, it's not personal to them.
That's right.
It's personal to our family. It's personal to the Padrones. It's personal to the Fuentes. It's personal to us. And a lot of people will talk about, all they're interested in is that they want to go down to their mom and pop store and buy a Cuban cigar. But they don't understand what Charlie just said, and it means nothing to them.
And listen, and once again, you can't take personal everything that happens in the world, right? So people say, yeah, but Charlie, look, we trade with Vietnam. Look at all the lives, that we lost in Vietnam. Charlie, we trade with Japan, and look at the wars we had with Japan. I agree, but we made peace with those countries, and we've evolved those relationships kind of both ways. It's maybe not perfect. I know we're always going to continue to work on trade issues, but believe me when I tell you that you're not going to be able to go to Cuba, because one of the few things Cuba does export other than people, is tobacco. It's one of the things that they're able to export for some cash, and that will be guarded. That will be jealously guarded. And as you can tell, I do have an issue, but I respect the people that say, Charlie, other things are personal to me that may not be personal to you. Well, then I want to listen to those people and figure out maybe I need to alter my views a little bit if I'm not taking some of those issues in mind. And all I ask is that when some people see us react, and by the way, we're representing, listen, I was born in Miami. But for the Cuban Revolution, I probably wouldn't have been born because both of my parents met in Miami. So I probably wouldn't have even be here. But again, my point is that some things are sometimes a little more complicated than that quick soundbite that we want to make it. And I just take issue sometimes with people who make it sound as simple when it's not.
Outstanding.
I certainly would have been born in Cuba because I was in my mom's belly when they fled.
Okay, yeah.
So I was months away from being born in Miami.
Well, you are significantly older than me, so
yes,
wow.
That makes more sense.
and the shot over the bow.
Ouch.
Indeed.
Can I take back that compliment on Charlie's last
I didn't hear the
statement?
compliment.
I thought it.
So I mean, it's interesting to hear, you guys speak of Cuba and to hear your guys' perspective from a family side. It's something that you don't hear of every day, and we certainly appreciate you guys sharing that. Let's talk about the future of cigars. Well, yeah, I hate to mention the three dreaded letters, the FDA. Where do you guys see the future with cigars? What do you see? What do you think's going on?
Truth is, I don't think I certainly don't know any more than the FDA does right now. We got all this looming regulation coming down the pike, but the clarity isn't there right now. So it's tough to answer those questions. I get asked about the FDA all the time. Eventually we'll know.
Look, number one, I am convinced, though, the cigar industry will be here. The cigar industry will, I think, continue to grow because I think there are people that nowadays are extremely passionate, both inside the industry and, more importantly, the consumer, right? The consumer who enjoys cigars is going to demand it. But things will change radically. The dynamics of the markets are going to change significantly. I think we're going to look back. Look, when I joined the cigar industry in 1996, we would import cigars and the max tax that we would pay was 5 cents.
Yep.
That's how it started. So again, to put that just in perspective, if you imported 100,000 cigars into the U.S., which a lot of distributors will do, and you hold it in inventory, you had to pay the government $5,000, right? So for $5,000,
before getting it out of customs.
Yeah, before you get it out of customs. Then we had the jump, though, in 2009 when the taxes went up to 41 cents. So all of a sudden, instead of paying $5,000, you now had to pay for those same 100,000 cigars. You now had to pay $41,000 in order to keep those same cigars. And we know, being in the industry, that had a major impact on the industry. So when you add on top of that, if you add more taxes, you add more regulations that make it difficult and in some cases impossible economically, if you make it economically non-viable to introduce a new brand of cigars into the market, because I got to spend 50 to 75, 80, some people say as high as 6 figures to launch a new brand. Is the cigar market going to be here? Yes, it will. But is it going to radically change where we used to go to the IPCPR you'd have a million, however many new brands? That's all going to change. So we're going to see consolidation. We're going to see a lot of things if the worst of what has been proposed goes into place. But I don't think anybody in this room really knows whether that's all going to take place. But if it does, we're going to look back to the glory days of cigars where there was so much innovation and a rapid pace of innovation that will go away.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing it obviously on our end as from the retail standpoint. It's people ask all the time, what's new? What's new?
Yeah.
And there's not a lot that's new. But given the fact that brands that were in before the predicate date that may have been discontinued or whatever. So I'm seeing a lot of what's old is now new. And that's it's, right. And there were, just tens of thousands of old brands that may come back with new packaging and, new bans and so forth on it, but allegedly with the same old blend. But the scary thing is that if it failed before because of the blend, what's going to happen now? This thing wasn't good back then, so what makes it good today? So
I think the hope, and you're right about that, Jeff. I think the hope in some cases, there were some great blends ultimately that didn't sell well for a myriad of reasons, non-blend related. And hopefully then some of those blends, when given a second look, could do well. It's possible.
Sure. Speaking of which, I would feel like, I would be doing you gentlemen a disservice if I didn't ask you, do you guys got anything new on the horizon, anything new coming out, maybe for the IPCPR coming up or for the remainder of the year, anything like that?
Well, actually, for Torano, what is old is new again. We are going back to our legacy brands, which we will have a small little facelift on them. The Exodus 1959 Gold, the Exodus 1959 50 Year, the Casa Torano Connecticut. These are all blends that everybody's familiar with, but, for one reason or another have kind of, because everybody's looking for the new release, have kind of not gone by the wayside, but haven't been selling as well as before. Same historically great blends, same cigars. We're going to reintroduce that core lineup of Torano's legacy brands with a small packaging update. Our vault lineup, which is the purple, the blue, the yellow, the green, we are going to close that series out with a Connecticut later in the year. And then next year we have a really cool, in 2003, 2004, 2008, we released a limited release tribute that did very well for us.
I remember that little box. It was like a box of 10, little brown box.
No. It was actually, there were boxes of 20.
Okay.
But they had that kind of like mosaic wood look to it.
And it had the little 2008 on the...
2008. So we're going to release a tribute 2019 that will kind of be a nod back to our fathers, our grandfather, to the entire family. And we're looking forward to that. We might actually collaborate on that with Benji Menendez, who a lot of people don't know is our cousin.
Oh yeah.
So
legend.
So might bring the legend Benji back to collaborate. Benji's
that would be great if that comes to pass.
Yeah. So a lot of good things happening. A lot of we kind of had to rebuild that core of Torano, that foundation, and we did that with the vault, the blends from the vault, and so there's a lot of predicate blends there, a lot of really good things in Torano's portfolio and history that will move us forward in a good way.
Outstanding. All right.
And I'll do my best to, get Charlie out of the retirement home every once in a while and take him out.
Bring him out.
Century Village, they're kind of lax on their
villages.
security.
That's why he's working on his golf game down there.
Yeah.
I'm loving the shuffleboard. Unreal. That
The
game is
Mahjong. He plays Mahjong on Thursdays.
Shuffleboard is underrated. I'm here to tell you.
Well, folks, you got to hear it from the third and fourth generation of Torano cigar makers. Gentlemen, we appreciate your time. We appreciate you guys coming out and sharing a little bit with us. We look forward to supporting you guys down the road, obviously, with the new blends and stuff that are coming out.
We appreciate it.
So thank you guys for coming. Any closing thoughts besides the fact that somebody's older than somebody else?
I think we're good. I mean,
I'm right in the
listen,
middle.
I am older. Charlie looks older. I can live with that.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm younger, but I'm wiser.
And you look good too. I just wanted to say that earlier. I mean, you look like you're in shape. This guy over here is ready to go.
Thank you.
All right, folks. That's all we got from Best Cigar Prices. Thank you again, gentlemen, for stopping in today. We appreciate your time. We'll be back soon. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be with you.
Jeff.